Hello everyone, Stakuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And before things begin, I just wanted to go ahead and address something. This video is going to be a little bit different than what I had initially anticipated going into it, because the topic is much larger than I ever anticipated. The video that I'm going to be doing right now is going to be covering the movie Oppenheimer, and the things that were in the film, as well as some of the things that were not in the film, and like what they did wrong and what they did right. But the scope of what it is that we're talking about here is huge, and what I wanted to talk about, the fallout and effects of the nuclear bombs of Los Alamos and everything, well, I didn't really want to mix in the significantly darker topics of what comes after with the video that would essentially otherwise be a movie analysis and review. It just wouldn't really make sense to construct it that way. The movie Oppenheimer is a crazy one, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about here today. But my next video is going to be addressing more of the serious things that the movie doesn't really address. So look forward to that. And without further ado, I hope you really enjoy this video. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. On today's episode, we're going to be asking ourselves a very simple question. And that question is, how accurate is Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer movie? I'm sure that a lot of you are already aware of this movie by now. We didn't do anything for any kind of review on any trailers or anything like that. In fact, I went into the Barbie movie as well as the Oppenheimer movie this last week completely blind. And my God, was I blown away. And no, I'm not trying to make a joke or anything like that, though the amount of explosive puns that I could make over the course of this episode are probably more than I'm capable of counting. This movie was absolutely an experience to watch. For anyone who is unaware of what I am talking about, Oppenheimer is a 2023 biographical drama film written and directed by Christopher Nolan. The film is chronicling the life of the American theoretical physicist and polymath J. Robert Oppenheimer. Many people going into this thought that it was just going to be about the atom bomb, and specifically the Manhattan Project to make it, but that really is not the case. This 3-hour-long movie covers large sections of Oppenheimer's life, starting from his early studies, his direction of the Manhattan Project during World War II, and even including his fall from grace in 1954 after a series of hearings that we're going to be talking about later. And then over the course of the entire film, it's going to include his interactions with the people around him, including some of the story of Louis Strauss, the man who would go on to be Oppenheimer's rival and a person that would eventually cause his downfall, at least to a degree. But we're going to be explaining that part here in a second, because the way that they frame and present this story is extremely interesting. And I will say this right now, for anyone who has seen the film or who hasn't seen the film in the first place, this film, the only way that I can really describe it is an experience. Like, if I can give my honest opinion of it, going into it in the first place, for the first 30 minutes to about an hour, I wasn't necessarily sure as much of what was going on. Myself being a history person, I could understand the individual events, knowing some of Oppenheimer's life, and pinpoint what was happening. But when I looked over next to me at my wife, who was watching the film, she just had a confused look on her face for the first hour or so of the film. This being because the chronological story that it tells is not exactly in chronological order in the first place. It jumps around for varying different things while presenting different parts of Oppenheimer's story as it gradually pieces together his life. And from that, you may think that I am here to critique the movie and tell you how bad it is, considering what it is that I have done with previous historical films, but that is not the case here. Because when I say that this movie is an experience, I mean that literally. It is something that if I had not seen it in a theater, I do not think that it would have had nearly the same impact as it would for someone who simply rents it 3 or 4 months from now to watch from home. Even a home theater system cannot do this movie justice with the sheer scope of the sound and the cinematography and everything in it. It is explosive in every sense of the word, and the sounds that you experience in a theater on all sides could be deafening at times. The acting is great, other than having the initial pacing issues where I thought that the chronological order was a little bit odd. The story that it told was extremely important and still echoes that importance to this day. It is an incredibly valuable film in my opinion. And for the most part, the movie has been a stunning success and praised everywhere except in certain parts of places like in the case of India. I'm obviously not going to put the exact scene up here for people to view because that's not something that I'm capable of doing, but there is a scene that shows Oppenheimer with his lover, Jean Tatlock, and in this scene, she opens a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, a Hindu religious text, and then asks Oppenheimer to read from it while they are performing their acts. To which Oppenheimer reads the famous line that we associate with the dropping of the atomic bomb, "Now I'm become death, destroyer of worlds." Some of the more Hindu nationalistic elements within India have taken offense to this and have called for boycotts to the film, but despite that, the film has been a success even in India. Generally speaking, other than some minor censorship of things due to sexual scenes or anything like that in some countries, things in general have not been cut from the film, and it's been a remarkable success. But of course, the controversies behind the film are not what I'm here to talk about today. The reason why I'm here is to talk about how accurate the film actually is. And I will say this from the beginning, I was genuinely impressed. It is rare for us to go into a film of something of this scope and not see changes that are put into things by Hollywood in order to make the story either more palatable for a wider audience or to just try and tell a specific story to push a specific narrative. It didn't really do that. Like, for the most part, Oppenheimer was accurate. Yes, there were some important developments that were shifted around in order to try and enhance the narrative structure because, you're still trying to tell the structure of a movie, but it wasn't necessarily things that were severe. Like, as an example, when we're talking about history, when the news that nuclear fission may have been accomplished by Otto Hahn in Berlin reached America in January of 1939, this was not something that was immediately done by the scientists at Berkeley in order to try and recreate the experiment as it shows. No, as soon as news arrived in America, the experiment was reproduced by two different sets of people, one being Herbert Anderson that was at the Columbia University, and another was Richard Roberts at the U.S. Naval Observatory. Not by Lawrence as it shows in the film, but that's something that is put in here in order to try and enhance the structure of the film. Like, I get it. There is one point regarding scientific discovery, though, that the film did exceptionally well, even if they only talked about it for just a moment. And what I'm referring to is the mathematical error of the guy that you can see behind me right here, Werner Heisenberg. And this is the mathematical mistake that probably prevented the Germans back in World War II being able to develop their own nuclear weapon. The mistake being the answer to the question of what would they choose to be the right moderator to enable the operation of a critical nuclear reactor using natural uranium as a fuel. I say natural as in uranium that was not enriched. Now, I will say this from the beginning because I know that every time something like this with science or math or anything pops up that I have to go ahead and provide a little bit of a disclaimer / clarification in the beginning, and that is that I am not a nuclear physicist. I am not a scientist. I am not anyone like that, but I'm going to try and explain the process as best I can in order for people to understand the history behind this thing. So when you are thinking of nuclear fission, the act of splitting the atom, right, it's a little bit different than what people initially thought that it was. Like, initially, what people thought would happen with fission is that you would have to fire high-energy neutrons like cannonballs into nuclei, but that is not actually the case. A better way to picture it is that neutrons will move around and get pulled into nuclei by nuclear forces, and as a result of that, this causes the nuclei to become unstable and split. From this, the best types of nuclei that can cause these reactions are not the fast-moving ones that you think are fired, but rather slower-moving neutrons. The older ones that have already lost energy from previous collisions. The frustrating thing that many scientists were experiencing in the beginning when they were trying to perform nuclear fission is that when a neutron collides with the nucleus of a reactor material, there is a chance that it can either just bounce away, wasting some energy, or some of this ends up getting absorbed by the material, which is a really bad thing and they don't want to happen. Because in order to sustain a chain reaction, you need to make sure that the amount of energy that is absorbed is below 50%. And the best material to slow down neutrons is light hydrogen, like water, but unfortunately, light hydrogen simultaneously absorbs a lot of neutrons, which is not something that you would want. So in order to use water as a moderator, the thing that you would need is either enriched uranium, which was not something that the Germans were able to do at the time, or heavy water. See, heavy water deuterium is great at slowing down neutrons with very little absorption. And so what Heisenberg had calculated historically was that in order to get the nuclear reaction that they needed, while simultaneously using natural uranium as a fuel, heavy water was the option that the Germans would have to go with. And the only place that you could actually get heavy water in Europe at this time, in substantial quantities that was needed, was at the Norwegian hydroelectric power plant at Vemork. So when the Germans invaded Norway, this was one of the first things that they went and took in order to be able to produce the heavy water that they would need. But of course, as we've already covered in a previous video, specifically talking about the heavy water program and the sabotage by the Norwegian saboteurs, these guys were able to get into the plant and blow it up, which only further delayed the Germans in their plan, something that would have been difficult to do anyway, because the science behind it was already kind of flawed. It's not that it was impossible necessarily to create a nuke, I guess, at least if I'm understanding the science right, but it would have taken an exceptionally large amount of resources and time that the Germans simply didn't have. What the Americans, on the other hand, went with is enriched uranium, not 238, but rather 235, and simultaneously they could use cheap graphite as a moderating job without the need for heavy water. And because this was so much better, there's this scene in the movie where the physicists are celebrating the news that Heisenberg has committed the German atomic program to heavy water production, and they're celebrating because they know that this is not the right move if speed is the question. And that scene is accurate. Like, they understand the gravity of the situation, even if the majority of the public that is watching this in the movie don't really understand that. And I appreciate that. There were so many more scenes like this where many people that may not understand the history of it don't really know what is going on, but each moment has such incredible gravity that you really, I think that for some people, after watching the movie, they're going to need to go and read an actual history on Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, and then go back and watch the movie again in order to be able to understand it better. Really, if I'm going to be talking about the mistakes in this movie, then there aren't that many. Like, there are a few that stood out to me. Like, one of the things that they focused on over the course of the film was the constant reminder that at some point, when the nuclear reaction sets off, it might never stop. There was this genuine fear at one point that the use of a fission bomb would result in a chain reaction that wouldn't stop and end up destroying the entire atmosphere of the Earth. And that is something that time and time again they keep on referring back to in the movie, trying to heighten the drama of like, oh my god, what if this happens? And that whole scene, and I say scene, it actually was a whole bunch of scenes that were repeated over and over again. In reality, this worry was very quickly dismissed once calculations showed that it was impossible. Nitrogen fission was not going to release any energy, and nitrogen fusion would be too slow to sustain the reaction that would be needed due to energy loss. So there was no risk of setting the entire world on fire during the Trinity test, but that's something that they continuously repeated over the course of the movie. I also probably should have cited this from the very beginning when talking about the thing with inaccuracies, considering that this was pretty much the first scene in the movie in the first place. A number of people may already be kind of familiar with the story and like the image that I have behind me right here, but there is the story that Oppenheimer once tried to poison one of his teachers. Which he did. But the scene that they show in the movie is different than what happened in real life, something that they added in specifically just to add an element of drama. You see, Oppenheimer as a student at Cambridge preferred theoretical ideas in science over actual experimental ones. His lab work suffered, and the teacher that he had at the time was constantly pushing him to do more lab work, to spend more time in the lab. And he hated that, and over the time would develop a rather antagonistic relationship with that teacher. And so after some time, as the story goes, out of frustration, Oppenheimer went and left an apple that was laced with toxic chemicals for that teacher, and that it may have been cyanide, but we're not talking like potassium cyanide like it shows in the movie, just cyanide, or some other type of chemical that would have made him sick rather than attempted murder like what it shows in the film. And there's a lot of speculation about that. We don't necessarily know what it is that he did or how exactly it went down, but what we do know is that ultimately Oppenheimer would only get minorly in trouble with the school rather than actually getting arrested like if he had tried to commit murder. It's theorized that in actual history, what would have happened is that the chemical should have only made the teacher sick with what he did, whereas in the movie, it shows Oppenheimer having a change of mind and then rushing back to try and take the apple because he's realized that he's tried to kill his teacher. Only for him to discover that it's not his teacher that's about to eat the apple, it's actually one of his idols there that he practically worships, another physicist. So he swipes the apple out of the guy's hand. It's just one of those scenes in here that is added for drama that is just, that's not accurate. That's not how it went down. Even if the theme of it is still actually true. Also, from that scene, it doesn't talk about the aftermath of it because it gives the impression that Oppenheimer managed to just escape from things with no problems whatsoever, but no, because of that incident, he did get into hot water with the university, but because of his family's wealth and influence, they were able to get the university to drop the charges effectively, and also to not expel him, but instead put him on probation. So yeah, the scene is embellished. It definitely didn't go down the way that it did, and I wish that it would have showed more of that because it would have talked more about Oppenheimer's position of privilege in society. But then, of course, that probably would have made his whole flirtation with communism just a little bit more ironic. So while the movie definitely did change some things, there were other aspects that I was pleasantly surprised that they didn't do. Like, as an example, one of the things that the film does not do is that it doesn't try to change the historical reality of World War II America in order to fit today's standards. Guys, this is not a social commentary channel, and I'm not going to generally talk about things with diversity, inclusion, or any of the other things that you tend to see in modern media that at different points, as we've talked about other productions, tend to have some issues with them with how they try and present and tell stories. Oppenheimer doesn't really do this, and there's only one female scientist that is actually shown working as part of Oppenheimer's team, and that's real. That did happen. Like the individual that you can see over here on this side, this is Leona Woods. She was one of the very valuable members of the Manhattan Project and had several discoveries and things tied to her name. Even though it doesn't really talk about any of these in the film because they're not necessarily prudent to the story, she has her own history, and it was really good that they included someone like her in it. Another thing that the movie did right is that while it kept things still kind of morally ambiguous, it didn't show the project staff being extremely morally conflicted and not wanting to use the bomb to end the war. There were some scenes and questions of it, but simultaneously most people were completely on board with the use of the bomb. And in fact, if we go back to the previous image that has Leona Woods in it, I have a quote directly from her from years afterwards that kind of shows the general feelings and what she specifically felt about it. I certainly do recall how I felt when the atomic bombs were used. My brother-in-law was captain of the first minesweeper scheduled into Sasebo Harbor, and my brother was a Marine with a flamethrower on Okinawa. I'm sure these people would not have lasted in an invasion. It was pretty clear that the war would continue, with 500,000 of our fighting men dead, not to say how many Japanese. I have no regrets. I think we did right and we couldn't have done it differently. Even to this day, the talk of nuclear weapons when it comes to history is kind of a giant can of worms. I myself have run into multiple issues when talking about things in shorts and the use of nuclear weapons in history, because sometimes when I'm making short content, people can think that I'm a little bit too flippant on it. But you have to understand that for the majority of people at this time period, there really was no moral alternative. Even though things in Europe had been coming to an end, the war was still raging across Asia, and the Pacific was costing tens of thousands of lives every single day. Whether it was American, whether it was British, Australian, Filipino, Polynesian, all the varying peoples that were affected in that time period as Japan was ravaging its way across Asia, it is estimated that a far more intense bloodbath would have taken place if Operation Downfall had to take place and the United States invaded the Japanese main islands. There is supposedly the more moderate option in which the United States could have instead surrounded Japan and blockaded it, eventually forcing it into submission, but that, considering where it was still operating all across Asia, that would have potentially cost still thousands or millions of more lives, depending on how long it dragged out. The thing about the use of nuclear weapons at this time is that it really is more morally ambiguous. I am not going to tell you all that are watching this right now whether it was right or wrong to use them, and honestly, when talking about things in the movie, I'm very happy with the fact that they didn't either. There's even this whole thing, which I'm not going to be able to show, but it shows Oppenheimer being first welcomed warmly by President Harry Truman. But then after their conversation, Harry Truman switches from being warm to showing utter contempt for Oppenheimer. This being specifically because Oppenheimer at this point is wrestling with the moral decision of having made the bomb in the first place that took so many lives. After shaming him, Truman says that no one is going to pay attention to the person who made the bomb. They're going to pay attention to the person that ordered it used, him. And that after that, he wanted the coward of Oppenheimer out of his office. Truman was an individual that was perfectly willing to take moral responsibility for all actions regarding the bomb. From all of that, Oppenheimer was never depicted as being someone that was anti-nuke, never anything like that. Just an individual that, considering everything that he had faced and seen, was morally conflicted and didn't want any more nukes to be used, which is something that is real. He specifically fought for nuclear non-proliferation for the rest of his life, and that is something that would end up creating a lot of problems for him in the future, as the film does touch upon, but not in the kind of detail that you would going into, say, a proper history video about him. Honestly, I have talked about a couple of the scenes in this movie, and I know that with a number of those, I've been rather nitpicky. Because as I said, I understand where liberties were specifically taken in order to make a more concrete structure to tell the story of Oppenheimer. If I could offer one genuine piece of criticism for the film over something that they did for the entirety of it, besides that whole part with causing a chain nuclear explosion that could end the world, that is that the weakest part of the film was definitely the portrayal of Oppenheimer's nemesis, Louis Strauss, the guy that you can see behind me here that was played by Robert Downey Jr. The acting was fine, it wasn't anything like that was the issue. It was more so the writing with the way that they portrayed him in this film was far more villainous than he was in real life. Strauss was an extremely complex person historically, but the way that they have him framed in the film is some kind of greedy bureaucrat that's trying to rise in the ranks by sabotaging everyone around him. One that does so while simultaneously portraying himself as the hero who wants to save things and only doing what is necessary. But he was an extremely complicated person with a long humanitarian streak that had done quite a lot for nuclear non-proliferation. This guy was one of the few major players to try and have the US take action in order to avert the Holocaust in the 1930s by trying to bring as many Jewish individuals over from Germany and the surrounding territories as they could. He was also one of the only guys that advocated for the use of the nuclear bomb not on a city as an actual target, but instead use it as a demonstration on some uninhabited island within view of the Japanese people so that they would be able to demonstrate the power of the bomb without sacrificing any lives whatsoever. And later on, he was one of the key figures that was pushing things for Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative, specifically to stop the use of nukes, to not have them used for war. But in the film, they end up turning him more into a politician with dark machinations. One who's trying to just unfairly bring Oppenheimer down, but the reality of that relationship is significantly more complex. For anyone who is not familiar with the story of Oppenheimer, what actually happens to him after the war, he would experience a severe fall from grace. One of the things that he was accused of over that time period was being a communist spy that was delivering nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, and while that definitely is not true, there were strong suspicions of his behavior and his previous contacts that would have definitely landed him in hot water during this time period following World War II and the rise of the Cold War. In terms of his political leanings, he was definitely still very left-leaning and had numerous social connections with various members of the Communist Party, including, well, his wife. His wife was a former member of the Communist Party, and the other lover that he had, Jean Tatlock, she was a current member of the Communist Party that over the course of that time period was continuously trying to convert him to join the party. Considering what was going on in the immediate aftermath of World War II with the Cold War, these kinds of security risks were not something that anyone looking in at him would be very pleased about. Furthermore, one of the things that Oppenheimer did was directly argue against the US developing the hydrogen bomb, or the H-bomb. The idea that Oppenheimer had at the time, and what it shows continuously pushing for him here, is that if the United States does not go and develop the H-bomb, then the Soviet Union is not going to develop it either because they're not going to see it as necessary. Which, to be honest, considering what we are talking about in terms of geopolitics, if you all know how countries behave, that is exceptionally naive wishful thinking. That is not going to happen. Every single country in the world, every single nation has skeletons in their closet. That is the reality of history, and that's how countries generally are formed in the first place. Not all the time necessarily, but it is a rare instance in which there is not something. And the Soviets, well, the Soviets had far more designs on the world than individuals like Oppenheimer or other Communist Party members within the United States were willing to admit. The Soviets were never willing to hold back when it came to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Never. In fact, one of the things that happened is that the Soviets demonstrated the first practical hydrogen bomb before the United States did. Oppenheimer may have been the great scientist who was able to develop the atomic bomb in the first place, but he was no politician or understanding of global politics in the first place. To his mind, historically, he thought that the world would react the same as a scientist, but that is not how people act. That is not how politicians act. That is not how the public acts. As long as he was fighting the Germans and the fascists in World War II, Oppenheimer was the perfect guy for the job, but he just wasn't an individual that was good for the complex reality of the Cold War following World War II. So when it came to the time that Strauss in the movie moves to dethrone him from his star position, you have to understand that this is not something that is done out of greed and a power grab as it kind of shows in the movie. There were real policy issues that were at stake here. And I'm going to go ahead and explain that in kind of rapid order so that people can understand what it is that I am talking about here. If we are talking about Strauss and his political leanings, then he was definitely more of a conservative Republican. And in comparison to Oppenheimer, he didn't really have anything in common. I mean, this was a guy who, as we said, was definitely more left-leaning and had many different communist associates. There were often times over the course of his story where he is flirting with the ideas of communism and is specifically pushing for a number of these ideals. As I already mentioned just a few minutes ago, Oppenheimer subsequently was a leading opponent of moving ahead with the hydrogen bomb and proposed a national security strategy instead based on atomic weapons and continental defense. Strauss had wanted to continue to push for the H-bomb and the development of weapons specifically for deterrence. Even regarding the knowledge of nuclear weapons, Oppenheimer wanted to pursue a policy of openness. He specifically pushed for openness regarding the numbers and capabilities of atomic weapons in America's arsenal to reveal this to the world. But Strauss was more of a realist who, looking at this, thought that it was incredibly naive and that frankness would benefit no one but the military planners of the Soviet Union who would use that information against the United States. Policy-wise, regarding how they would handle things for nuclear weapons or knowledge, they could not be more polar opposites. And many of the ideas that Oppenheimer had at this time could definitely be seen as dangerous to the United States and only beneficial to somewhere like the Soviet Union. But that's only talking about differences in terms of policy. One of the things that definitely was true is that Strauss disliked Oppenheimer personally more than just through politics. There is a scene that I'm not able to necessarily pull up here where Oppenheimer publicly embarrassed Strauss by challenging him in a meeting and refuting his stance on a particular topic. That shame in front of a scientific board would carry forward for many years and he would always remember it. If we go back to that whole point about the communist lover and relationships that he had, Strauss disliked this as he hated the more licentious attitude that Oppenheimer would take over the course of his life. Not only that, but Strauss also did not like that Oppenheimer had seemingly left his Jewish heritage behind, whereas Strauss, on the other hand, he also had Jewish heritage and had managed to succeed despite a lot of the more anti-Semitic thought of the time. And so when President Eisenhower went and offered Strauss the AEC chairmanship, Strauss named one condition to take the job, and that was that Oppenheimer was going to be excluded from all atomic work. Well, at least all the stuff that was supposed to be classified. You have to understand, and this is one of the things that they focus in on in the movie, is that Oppenheimer had the highest degree of clearance possible. He was simultaneously one of the most respected figures in the atomic community. And so with this being done, with the idea of his clearance being revoked or not getting access to things, you can start to see where the relationship between them really breaks down. But as I said earlier, this wasn't a whole matter of just disliking and disagreeing on policy. Anyone can have these kinds of issues. The larger problem was the fact that Oppenheimer had a lot of communist affiliates prior to World War II, and there were still questions about his loyalty, even if they didn't have as much merit, but there were valid concerns. For instance, one of the things that Strauss was suspicious of was Oppenheimer's tendency to downplay Soviet capabilities. In 1953, Oppenheimer would state in a July edition of Foreign Affairs that he believed that the Soviets were about 4 years behind in nuclear weapons. The United States had already exploded their own thermonuclear device that previous year, but only a single month after Oppenheimer made that declaration, the Soviets would detonate their own. At the time, they declared that they had tested their own fusion-based bomb, but that wasn't exactly the case. Instead, US censors picked this up as a boosted fission weapon, and it's incidents and statements like that that would cause people and scientists and other political figures to look in at Oppenheimer and think, hey, maybe this guy is actually up to something. There was a genuine valid concern at this time, even if in the movie, it makes it seem completely unfair. So historically, what then happens is in September of 1953, Strauss, hoping to uncover some degree of evidence of Oppenheimer's disloyalty, ends up asking the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, to initiate surveillance in order to track down Oppenheimer's movements and see if there's anything that they can figure out. The director did so, but didn't find any evidence of Oppenheimer actually being disloyal. And you would think that things would have stopped there, but no, there were further discoveries, such as that in 1948 and 1949, Oppenheimer had tried to stop the long-range airborne detection system that Strauss had really pushed for in order to be able to detect the Soviet Union's atomic tests. The fact that Oppenheimer stood against this was suspicious because why would an individual push to not have testing equipment in order to be able to see what perhaps the Soviets are doing? So then in December of 1953, the FBI notified Strauss that it was not going to watch Oppenheimer unless it received a direct request to do so. Strauss then provided this, and Director Hoover then ordered full surveillance on Oppenheimer. They went through his trash, they tapped his phones, they did everything possible to monitor him and see if there was any kind of dirt that they could bring up on him. All of that it shows in the film is real, but it only shows the actions and it doesn't really explain the context behind it that was the reality of the World War. It only shows the things from the persecution on the American side, not what was happening with the global reality of what the Soviets were doing. Which then brings us to another one of the big points in the movie that it talks about, because Strauss is most often strongly remembered as the driving force in the month-long hearings that were held between April and May of 1954 before an AEC personal security board that resulted in Oppenheimer's security clearance being revoked. Strauss had access to the FBI's information on Oppenheimer, including his conversations with his lawyers, which then ahead of time was used to prepare counter-arguments on him that he had no way to really respond to. And so in the end, despite all of the support that Oppenheimer received from the public, from the scientific community, from everyone, all of the support that he received, his security clearance was revoked a day before it was set to expire. And by all accounts, the hearings that he went through, as it shows in the movie, did break his spirit, and he was a completely different person afterwards. I'm not going to spoil the movie for anyone who has not seen it yet, but the entire purpose of all of this that it shows, of the events of the Cold War and the downfall of Oppenheimer and the rise of Strauss, specifically is culminating in the appointment of Strauss to a cabinet position. The result of which I'm not going to be revealing here, because if you really want to see it, you should check out the movie yourself. I will go ahead and say this again at the end. The movie of Oppenheimer is something that is an incredible experience that one really has to watch, and I would honestly say watch in a theater in order to get the full experience of it. It is a movie that, despite taking some liberties in order to dramatize certain aspects, does not take nearly as many historical liberties as one would normally expect out of Hollywood, especially nowadays. It doesn't try to preach a message at you. It doesn't really try to change a story. It, generally speaking, keeps things morally ambiguous. And amazingly enough, there are only certain aspects of the film that end up turning into aspects of melodrama. Besides the things that I have really listed here in the end, the film is genuinely amazing, and I would highly recommend that before anyone goes and watches it, they go and just look up Oppenheimer's entry on Wikipedia, something to go and give yourself a degree of cursory knowledge about it before watching it. And when you do, things are going to make significantly more sense than if you just go into it dry. Either way, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel, and I thank each and every one of you for watching. If there's any other types of media or other things that you would like for me to do an analysis of or to check out, please let me know down in the comment section below. But my God, this was actually an incredible thing, and I'm very surprised that over the course of me making this, that it didn't result in me having to critique something and lambast it across the internet. I am amazed. Anyway, I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and I will see you all next time. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.